The story began on a rain-lashed morning in Portland, Oregon, the kind of morning when the sky looked bruised and the streets outside the hospital were buried under sheets of cold gray water. Inside the maternity ward, everything had been moving the way it should. Nurses passed in and out with rehearsed urgency. Monitors blinked. Metal trays rattled. Doctors spoke in clipped, practical tones. It was supposed to be a difficult birth, maybe an exhausting one, but still a normal one. That was what everyone believed right up until the exact moment the child entered the world and the room changed forever. Because the cry that rang out from the delivery bed was not the sound anyone was prepared for. It was sharp, raw, human, and yet it seemed to split the air in a way that made every person in the room stop. The first doctor who lifted the baby did not speak. The second one stepped closer, then froze. A nurse who had assisted in hundreds of births went pale so quickly it looked as if all the blood had drained from her face at once. The father, Elias Mercer, stared ahead as though his mind had stopped working. The mother, Naomi Hale, still weak from labor and barely conscious from the strain, managed only one look before the shock overwhelmed her and sent her into darkness. The child had been born with one body and two heads. Not a rumor. Not a whispered exaggeration. Not a mistake created by fear or panic. It was there, undeniable, impossible, and so rare that even the senior specialists in the hospital seemed to be standing at the edge of something they had only ever encountered in medical literature. In one instant, what should have been the happiest morning of two people's lives became the beginning of a collapse neither of them could yet understand. The baby was rushed out almost immediately. The delivery room, moments earlier filled with effort and expectation, fell into a silence so heavy it seemed to muffle even the storm outside. Machines still hummed. Instruments still gleamed under the overhead lights. But the emotional temperature of the room had dropped into something cold and unreal. No one wanted to say the wrong thing, because there was no right thing to say. Elias did not cry. He did not shout. He did not ask questions. He simply stood there with the expression of a man who had been struck by something too large to feel all at once. Naomi was moved into recovery, but when she woke, the world no longer felt solid. The brief image she had seen before fainting had burned itself into her mind with cruel clarity. Her child had not done anything wrong. The baby had not asked for this body, this fate, this terrifying first moment in the world. And yet the sheer shock of it shattered something inside her. The instinct to reach for her child was there, somewhere, buried beneath a grief so violent she could barely breathe around it. Nurses tried to speak gently. Doctors tried to reassure her that the baby was alive, that specialists were evaluating the condition, that more information would come. But none of that could touch the raw horror of a mother realizing that her child had entered life already trapped inside suffering. The neonatal intensive care unit became the center of everyone's existence over the next several days. The baby was placed under constant observation. Specialists in genetics, neurology, pediatrics, and maternal-fetal medicine were called in. Charts multiplied. Consultations stretched late into the night. Every possible explanation was considered, tested, retested, then discussed again. Blood work, imaging, developmental assessments, family history reviews, chromosomal analysis, rare congenital anomaly protocols. The hospital moved with the precision of science, but beneath it all there was a truth nobody could avoid. This case was extraordinary, and nobody could promise what came next. Outside the ICU, the emotional damage began spreading in quieter, more devastating ways. Naomi stopped asking to see the baby. Not because she felt disgust, and not because she lacked love, but because every time she imagined walking into that room, she felt herself slipping into a panic she could not control. The guilt of that nearly crushed her. She could not hold the child without trembling. She could not look too long without feeling as if her own heart were being torn open from the inside. Her silence deepened day by day until it became the only way she knew how to survive. A woman who had once been warm, easy to laugh, and full of the ordinary joy of expecting her first child seemed to vanish behind a wall of numbness and pain. Elias tried to become the strong one because there was no other role left for him. He moved between Naomi's room and the ICU like a man performing duties by instinct rather than thought. He spoke to doctors. He signed forms. He listened to medical explanations no parent should ever have to hear. He tried to comfort his wife even as he was drowning himself. He told her they would get through this, that medicine could help, that they would find answers, that somehow they would survive what had happened. But each reassurance sounded thinner than the last, even to him. Behind every sentence was the fear he refused to name, that this was only the beginning, and that whatever came next would be worse. The families arrived and brought with them the chaos that always follows catastrophe. Concern turned into speculation. Speculation turned into whispers. Whispers turned into long silences whenever a doctor approached. People cried in private corners. People searched online for conditions they did not understand. People said things like miracle and tragedy and God's will because ordinary language was too small for what they were seeing. Yet beneath all of the confusion, another tension had begun to grow, one that at first no one recognized. The doctors were not only focused on the baby's visible condition anymore. Some of the test results were leading them toward questions about heredity, and those questions were becoming impossible to ignore. A week after the birth, the DNA findings came back. By then, exhaustion had hollowed everyone out. Naomi looked like someone who had not truly slept in years. Elias had the stretched, haunted expression of a man running on shock alone. Both sides of the family were asked to come to the hospital. The request itself was enough to change the air. Doctors do not gather entire families in one room to share routine updates. Whatever this was, it was serious enough that no one should hear it secondhand. The conference room felt colder than it should have. Rain struck the windows in restless waves. A ceiling light buzzed faintly overhead. Papers sat in a neat stack on the table, and the lead physician wore the careful expression of someone who knew the next few minutes would destroy lives. No one spoke much while waiting. A cough here. A shifting chair there. Eyes fixed on the tabletop, the wall, the folded hands of strangers who had become family through marriage and were about to learn that even those bonds were not what they seemed. Then the doctor began explaining the results with the kind of precision used when truth is too dangerous to deliver casually. The tests had been repeated multiple times. There had been no laboratory error. The genetic markers were consistent across every review. The baby's condition had led the team to investigate the parental DNA more closely. And what the testing revealed was not a distant familial overlap, not a vague shared ancestry from generations back, but something immediate, direct, and catastrophic. The couple were closely related by blood. Not cousins. Not extended relations. Brother and sister. What followed was not shouting at first. It was worse than shouting. It was the kind of silence that erupts inside people before it reaches the room. Naomi stared forward as if she had stopped understanding language. Elias's face emptied of all expression, the human mind instinctively refusing a reality it cannot absorb. One of Naomi's relatives began shaking. Another covered their mouth. Somebody whispered that it was impossible. Somebody else began to cry before a single explanation had been given. The truth had landed, but it had not yet fully unfolded, and already it was tearing the foundations out from under everyone there. Then Naomi's biological parents, trembling under the weight of something they had buried for decades, told the story that should have come to light years earlier. When Naomi was 3 years old, she had disappeared during a crowded public event in Sacramento, California. One moment she had been beside her family, and the next she was gone. The search had consumed years. Police reports, missing posters, investigators, dead-end sightings, false hope followed by devastation. At some point, the family had done what grieving families sometimes do when they can no longer survive on hope alone. They accepted the possibility that the child was gone forever. Not because they wanted to stop loving her, but because life had forced them into a brutal compromise with uncertainty. What nobody knew was that the missing girl had not died. She had been taken into another life, raised under another identity, and grown into adulthood without any knowledge of where she came from. She had become Naomi Hale. She had met Elias Mercer by chance. She had fallen in love naturally, sincerely, completely. They had built a marriage, made plans, shared a home, and conceived a child, all without the faintest idea that the bond between them had existed long before romance ever began. It was the kind of truth that did not merely reveal itself. It detonated. In one stroke, the horror of the birth was fused to a deeper horror beneath it. The child in intensive care was no longer only a medical tragedy. The baby had become living proof of a hidden past, a buried crime, a family history fractured so completely that two siblings had found each other in adulthood and loved each other without knowing who they were. Everything that had once seemed normal now rearranged itself into something grotesque and irreversible. Their wedding photographs, their first apartment, their private jokes, the memory of their vows, the ordinary tenderness of their marriage, all of it was suddenly contaminated by knowledge neither of them had chosen. And that was what made it unbearable. This was not a story of deception between lovers. It was not built on betrayal in the way people expect betrayal to look. Neither of them had known. Neither of them had intended harm. Their love had been real, which only made the revelation crueler. If hatred had existed between them, the separation might have been easier. If one had lied to the other, then blame might have created a path forward. But there was no villain sitting at that conference table. There were only two shattered people discovering that the life they had built together had been standing on a truth so monstrous it could not survive exposure. From that moment on, everything changed. Naomi collapsed inward completely. Her silence was no longer only grief over the baby. It was the silence of a person watching her own identity split open. The past she thought she owned no longer belonged to her. Even her own name now felt unstable. Her marriage had been real, but it had also become impossible in a single afternoon. The child she had carried was still her child, still innocent, still deserving of love, yet now tied forever to a truth that would haunt every breath she took. The scale of it was too much for one mind to process at once, so she stopped trying. She drifted through the following days like someone moving underwater, hearing things from far away, feeling everything and nothing in the same moment. Elias suffered differently, but no less violently. He kept trying to function because action was easier than collapse. He read the reports. He met with doctors. He answered calls. He reassured relatives he himself did not believe. Yet beneath that motion was the sickening repetition of one single thought: the woman he loved had not stopped being the woman he loved. That feeling had not vanished just because the truth had arrived. And that was exactly what made the truth so unbearable. Love remained, but it had nowhere moral to go. It became a living wound inside him, one he could neither obey nor erase. The child remained in intensive care, while the adults around that hospital room came apart piece by piece. Medical staff continued their work, but the family was no longer dealing with one disaster. They were dealing with several, all layered together so tightly that no one could untangle where one ended and the next began. There was the baby's condition. There was Naomi's psychological collapse. There was the revelation of blood relation. There was the disappearance and lost identity from childhood. There was the unbearable fact that two people who had found genuine love were now expected to sever it, not because it had failed, but because it should never have existed in the first place. By the end of that first week, the hospital no longer felt like a place of treatment. It felt like a place where lives were being dismantled under fluorescent light. And the worst part was this: the story was only beginning. After the truth surfaced, nothing in that hospital remained intact. Not the marriage, not the families, not even the idea of who Elias Mercer and Naomi Hale believed themselves to be. The revelation did not explode outward in chaos the way people might expect. It spread inward, quietly, destructively, like a crack moving through glass that had already been weakened by impact. Every memory they shared began to shift under a new light, and the more they tried to hold onto what they had, the more it slipped away from them. The hospital discharged Naomi after several days, but recovery in a medical sense had nothing to do with what she was facing. Her body had survived childbirth. Her mind had not survived the aftermath. She returned with her biological parents to a home that felt both familiar and foreign at the same time. The people around her carried the weight of guilt for losing her decades earlier, and now that guilt had mutated into something heavier. They had not only lost her once, in a way, they had unknowingly allowed her to walk into a life that would destroy her twice. Naomi moved through the house like a shadow of herself. She ate when reminded. She slept in fragments. She avoided mirrors. The person staring back no longer felt like someone she recognized. Every attempt to think clearly about her life led to the same dead end. Her childhood was not what she thought it was. Her identity had been built on a missing foundation. The man she married was not simply her husband. He was her brother. The child she gave birth to was both her baby and a symbol of everything that had gone wrong long before she could remember. These thoughts did not arrive one at a time in a manageable sequence. They came all at once, overlapping, repeating, pressing in from every direction until the only defense her mind could find was silence. Elias, meanwhile, remained in the city, but the place he had once called home began to feel like a trap. The apartment they had shared still held the shape of their life together. Their furniture remained in place. Their photographs still hung on the walls. The kitchen still carried the faint memory of ordinary mornings. But every object now felt contaminated. The past had not changed physically, yet it had become impossible to look at without seeing the truth beneath it. Elias found himself unable to stay inside for long. He would leave, wander the streets without purpose, then return only because he had nowhere else to go. The baby remained under intensive care, but even that situation became more complicated than anyone had expected. Doctors continued their evaluations, but the focus of the family had already begun to shift away from hope and toward endurance. There were no simple solutions being offered. The condition was severe, and while the medical team worked relentlessly, there were limits to what could be done. The existence of the child forced both Elias and Naomi to confront their connection again and again, even as they were being pushed apart by the truth. Every update from the hospital carried both a sense of responsibility and a sense of unbearable weight. The families attempted to maintain some structure, but beneath every conversation there was tension that could not be resolved. Questions began to surface, not in open confrontation, but in fragmented, uncomfortable exchanges. How had this happened? Who was responsible for Naomi's disappearance years ago? Why had the past remained hidden for so long? These questions had no answers that could fix anything. They only deepened the sense that the present disaster had roots buried far beyond anyone's reach. As days turned into weeks, the unavoidable reality began to take shape. Elias and Naomi could not continue as a couple. It was not a decision driven by a lack of love. In fact, that was the very reason the decision became so painful. Their feelings had not disappeared simply because the truth had emerged. If anything, the emotional bond between them made the separation more brutal. They were not leaving each other because they wanted to. They were leaving because staying would mean living inside a reality neither of them could accept. The process of ending their marriage unfolded without the dramatic confrontations that often accompany divorce. There were no arguments over betrayal, no raised voices accusing the other of wrongdoing. Instead, there was a quiet, suffocating grief that settled into every interaction. Paperwork was signed with steady hands that concealed internal collapse. Legal procedures moved forward with clinical efficiency, as though the system handling their separation had no awareness of the emotional devastation behind it. Each step taken toward dissolving their marriage felt less like a choice and more like an inevitability they had no power to resist. Naomi did not attend many of the formal proceedings. Her family handled most of it, shielding her from details she could not yet process. She spent long hours in therapy sessions where words came slowly, often breaking apart before they could fully form. The therapists guiding her understood that her trauma was layered. It was not only about the recent events. It was about a lifetime built on missing information, now collapsing under the weight of truth. Helping her meant navigating through grief, identity confusion, and the loss of a relationship that had once defined her sense of belonging. Elias approached the situation differently. He forced himself to be present for each step, as if confronting the reality directly might make it easier to survive. He reviewed documents. He met with legal advisors. He confirmed decisions that felt irreversible. But beneath that controlled exterior, something inside him was eroding. He was losing not only his wife but also the version of himself that had existed with her. The future he had imagined was gone, replaced by an emptiness that stretched forward without clear direction. The separation created physical distance between them, but it did not erase the emotional connection. Both of them found themselves thinking about the same moments, the same shared experiences, now reframed by knowledge they could not ignore. What had once been simple happiness now carried an unbearable complexity. They had loved each other sincerely. That fact did not disappear. It remained, but it no longer fit into a life they could continue living. The baby's condition continued to hang over everything, a constant reminder that the consequences of their relationship were not abstract. Medical updates became less frequent as the situation stabilized in a fragile, uncertain way. The child's future remained unclear, and discussions about long-term care began to surface. These conversations were practical on the surface, but beneath them was the emotional reality that neither Elias nor Naomi knew how to define their role anymore. They were parents, yet the foundation of their parenthood had been shattered. As the divorce was finalized, the moment did not bring closure. There was no sense of resolution, no relief, no clear transition into a new phase of life. Instead, it marked the point where everything they had once been was officially over. The legal bond was broken, but the emotional aftermath remained unresolved. They did not part with final words meant to summarize their relationship. There were no declarations, no attempts to explain what could not be explained. They simply separated, each carrying a version of the same story that neither of them could fully tell. After the separation, Naomi withdrew further into her recovery process. Therapy became her primary connection to the outside world. Her family remained close, offering support that was steady but often insufficient to reach the depth of what she was experiencing. Progress came slowly, measured not in dramatic breakthroughs but in small, fragile steps. She began to speak more, to acknowledge parts of her past without immediately shutting down. These moments were not victories in the traditional sense, but they represented movement, however slight, away from complete isolation. Elias did not have the same structured support system. His family remained present, but he struggled to accept help in a meaningful way. He continued working, using routine as a way to maintain some sense of control. On the surface, his life began to resemble something stable again. He woke up, went to work, returned home, and repeated the cycle. But beneath that routine, the emotional weight remained unresolved. He carried the memory of Naomi with him constantly, not as something he could return to, but as something he could not fully leave behind. The distance between them grew not because they wanted it, but because it was necessary. Contact became minimal, limited to essential updates and practical matters. Each interaction was careful, controlled, stripped of anything that might reopen wounds they were trying to manage. Yet even in that restraint, the connection lingered. It existed in the pauses, in the things left unsaid, in the awareness that the other person still understood something no one else could fully grasp. By the end of those months, both Elias and Naomi had entered a new phase of their lives, one defined not by resolution but by survival. The initial shock had passed, but the deeper consequences had only begun to unfold. They were no longer standing at the moment of impact. They were living inside the aftermath, where every decision carried the weight of what had already happened. And beneath everything, there was a growing realization neither of them could ignore. The hardest part was not discovering the truth. The hardest part was learning how to keep living with it. Time did not move forward for Elias Mercer in any meaningful way after the divorce. It passed, but it did not carry him with it. Days stacked on top of each other without distinction, each one shaped by the same hollow routine that looked functional from the outside but felt completely empty within. He returned to work because it was expected. He answered emails, attended meetings, completed tasks that once required focus but now demanded only mechanical effort. People around him noticed a change but could not define it clearly. He spoke less. He smiled when necessary. He avoided questions that reached too close to anything real. The apartment he now lived in was smaller, quieter, and stripped of anything that could remind him too directly of the life he had lost. But absence did not bring relief. It created a different kind of pressure. Without visible reminders, his mind filled the space on its own. Memories surfaced without warning, vivid and intrusive. They did not come as distant recollections softened by time. They came as if they were still happening, sharp and immediate. Naomi's presence lingered in everything he did, not as a comfort, but as a constant reminder of something he could never return to. Sleep became inconsistent. Some nights he lay awake for hours, staring at the ceiling, unable to slow the pace of his thoughts. Other nights he drifted into restless sleep filled with fragmented dreams that pulled him back into moments he could not escape. Waking up did not bring clarity. It only marked the beginning of another cycle he did not know how to break. His body continued functioning, but his sense of purpose had thinned to the point where it barely existed. Isolation deepened gradually, almost unnoticed at first. He stopped responding to messages as quickly. He declined invitations without offering explanations. Conversations became shorter, less frequent, easier to avoid entirely. The people who cared about him remained present, but the distance between them grew in ways that were difficult to measure. It was not hostility or rejection that created that distance. It was the quiet withdrawal of someone who no longer believed they had anything worth sharing. The weight of everything he had experienced did not settle into a single emotion. It shifted constantly between grief, confusion, guilt, and something harder to define. He questioned his past, not in a way that could produce answers, but in a way that kept reopening wounds. He revisited moments from his relationship with Naomi, trying to reconcile what they had meant then with what they meant now. The love had been real. That fact did not change. But the context surrounding it had transformed completely, leaving him trapped between two truths that could not coexist. The breaking point did not arrive suddenly. It formed slowly, built from small moments that accumulated over time. A memory that lingered too long. A silence that stretched too far. A realization that the future he had once imagined no longer existed in any form he could recognize. Each of these moments alone might have been manageable. Together, they created a pressure that continued to build without release. One night, the weight became too much to carry. The city outside his apartment moved as it always did, indifferent to what was happening inside. Lights from neighboring buildings flickered through the windows. Distant traffic created a low, constant hum. Life continued, steady and unaware. Inside, the apartment remained dark. Elias had not turned on the lights. He sat on the floor, his back resting against the side of the couch, surrounded by a stillness that felt heavier than silence. On the small table in front of him lay several blister packs of sleeping pills. They had been there for days. At first, they were nothing more than a practical solution to his inability to rest. Over time, they became something else. Not a plan, not a decision, but a possibility that lingered in the background of his thoughts. He had not acted on it. He had not fully acknowledged it. But he had not removed it either. It remained within reach, quietly present, waiting for a moment when the balance between endurance and exhaustion might shift. That night, it did. He stared at the pills for a long time without moving. The simplicity of them stood in contrast to the complexity of everything he was feeling. They were small, ordinary, unremarkable objects. Yet they represented an escape from something he no longer believed he could manage. The idea did not arrive with dramatic intensity. It came quietly, almost gently, as if offering relief rather than demanding action. He had spent months trying to rebuild something inside himself. He had followed routines, accepted help in limited ways, and maintained the appearance of stability. But none of those efforts had removed the core of what he was carrying. The pain had not disappeared. It had only changed shape, becoming less visible but no less present. The thought that he might not have the strength to continue living with it began to feel less like failure and more like an unavoidable conclusion. He reached for the pills slowly, without urgency. There was no panic in his movements. No sudden surge of emotion. If anything, there was a strange sense of calm, the kind that sometimes appears when a person believes they have reached the end of their options. He held them in his hand, turning them slightly, as if examining something that needed to be understood before it could be used. Time seemed to narrow around him. The apartment faded into the background. The noise from outside became distant, almost unreal. What remained was the moment itself, reduced to a single decision that felt both enormous and oddly simple. Everything he had experienced led to this point, not in a clear line, but through a series of turns that had gradually brought him here. As he sat there, fragments of memory surfaced again, but this time they carried a different weight. They were not only reminders of what he had lost. They were reminders of what had existed before everything changed. Naomi's presence appeared in those memories not as something forbidden or broken, but as something genuine that had once brought meaning into his life. That realization did not ease his pain. It complicated it further. It made the idea of leaving feel both like an escape and like a surrender of something that had once been worth holding on to. The pills remained in his hand, waiting for him to act. There was no clear moment when the decision was made. It was not a sudden shift or a dramatic realization. It was a gradual leaning toward something he had been considering without fully admitting it. The line between thought and action blurred, and he found himself moving forward without resistance. But just as that movement reached its most critical point, something interrupted it. Not in a way that resolved everything instantly, and not in a way that erased the pain he was feeling, but enough to break the isolation of the moment. Enough to remind him that the world outside that apartment had not disappeared, even if he had withdrawn from it. The interruption did not solve anything. It did not provide answers or relief. But it created a pause. And in that pause, something shifted just enough to keep the story from ending there. Because that night, in the quiet space between decision and action, Elias Mercer did not disappear. And the fact that he remained, fragile, uncertain, and still in pain, would become the turning point that everything after depended on. The interruption that night did not arrive as a miracle. It came in a way that felt messy, human, and urgent. Exactly the way real life pushes back when someone gets too close to disappearing. The silence inside Elias Mercer's apartment was broken not by a single dramatic moment, but by persistence from the outside world refusing to let him vanish quietly. His phone had been lighting up long before he reached for the pills. Calls missed. Messages left unanswered. Concern building on the other side of a screen he had already decided to ignore. The people who cared about him had noticed the distance growing over weeks, then months. The changes had been subtle at first, easy to dismiss. But something about that night felt different to them, even from afar. The silence was too complete. The absence too sharp. When the door finally opened, it shattered the fragile isolation Elias had built around himself. The space that had felt sealed and separate from everything else was suddenly exposed. Light entered. Movement followed. Voices, urgent, shaken, filled the room. The pills that had seemed like the center of everything lost their focus in an instant as reality rushed back in with force. Elias did not resist. He did not try to hide what he had been about to do. There was no energy left for denial or defense. He remained where he was, caught between the decision he had nearly made and the presence of the people who had refused to let him make it alone. The moment stretched, heavy with everything that could have happened and everything that still might. His mother reached him first, her fear cutting through the room more sharply than any words. The sight of him sitting there, the pills within reach, confirmed what she had been afraid of but had not fully allowed herself to believe. The reaction was immediate, instinctive, driven by something deeper than logic. She pulled him back into the world not through arguments or reasoning, but through raw emotion, through the undeniable fact that his life was tied to more than just his own pain. The others followed, his father, a close friend, each bringing their own form of urgency into the room. The atmosphere shifted from stillness to tension, from isolation to confrontation. Not confrontation in the sense of blame, but confrontation with reality. Elias was no longer alone with his thoughts. He was surrounded by people who could see exactly how close he had come to the edge. What unfolded next did not resolve anything cleanly. There were no sudden breakthroughs, no immediate clarity. Elias did not transform in that moment into someone who wanted to live again. What happened instead was smaller, more fragile, and far more realistic. The presence of others created a barrier between him and the decision he had been about to make. It disrupted the momentum that had been building inside him. It forced him to pause, to step back, even if only slightly. That night stretched on without rest. No one left him alone. The apartment, once silent and dark, remained filled with movement and quiet vigilance. Conversations drifted in and out, not as structured attempts to fix anything, but as a way to keep him anchored. They spoke about ordinary things, about memories, about moments that had nothing to do with the crisis unfolding in front of them. It was not distraction in the shallow sense. It was an effort to remind him, piece by piece, that his life existed beyond the pain that had consumed him. Elias listened more than he spoke. When he did respond, it was brief, almost detached. The exhaustion inside him ran deeper than physical fatigue. It was the exhaustion of carrying something that had no clear solution. Yet even in that state, something subtle began to shift. Not enough to remove the pain, not enough to create hope, but enough to prevent him from slipping further into the isolation that had brought him to that moment. By morning, the decision had been made for him, not by force, but by necessity. He needed help beyond what his family and friends could provide on their own. The line he had approached the night before made it impossible to ignore how serious his condition had become. What had been internal and hidden was now visible, undeniable. He was taken to see a mental health specialist later that day. The first sessions were difficult. Elias did not engage easily. He sat through them with the same distant expression he had carried for weeks. Questions were asked. Silence followed. Attempts were made to guide him toward expressing what he felt, but the words did not come quickly. His experience was too complex to compress into simple explanations. The therapist understood this. Progress was not expected immediately. What mattered was that he was there, that he had not disappeared, that there was still time to work through what he was carrying. Gradually, the silence began to break. Not all at once, and not in a steady line, but in fragments. A sentence here. A memory there. A moment when he allowed himself to acknowledge something he had been avoiding. The sessions became a space where the contradictions inside him could exist without immediate judgment. He spoke about Naomi, about the love that had not vanished even after the truth had been revealed. He spoke about the confusion of holding on to something that he knew he could never return to. He spoke about the guilt, not because he had done something wrong intentionally, but because he felt responsible for the consequences that had followed. The therapist did not offer simple solutions. There were none to give. Instead, the process focused on helping him understand that the pain he was experiencing did not mean he had to stop existing. That the absence of an easy answer did not mean there was no path forward at all. It was a slow, deliberate effort to separate the intensity of his emotions from the finality of the decision he had nearly made. At one point, the conversation turned toward the night in the apartment. Not as a dramatic retelling, but as a point of reflection. The question was not framed around blame or regret, but around understanding. What had led him there? What he had believed in that moment? What he thought would happen if he had gone through with it? Elias struggled with that question. His initial instinct was to reduce it to something simple, to say that it would have ended the pain. But as the discussion unfolded, he began to see the gap between what he had believed and what was actually true. The pain might have ended for him, but it would not have disappeared. It would have shifted, transferred to the people who cared about him, creating new wounds in place of the ones he was trying to escape. That realization did not erase his suffering. It did not make his situation easier. But it introduced a different perspective, one that complicated the idea of escape. It forced him to consider that his existence, even in its current state, still had an impact beyond himself. That the decision to stay or leave was not isolated, even if it had felt that way in the moment. Outside of therapy, his daily life began to adjust in small ways. He started eating regularly again, not out of desire, but out of routine. Sleep improved slightly, though it remained inconsistent. He continued working, but with less pressure to perform at the level he had maintained before. His family stayed close, not in an overwhelming way, but in a steady, consistent presence that he could rely on without feeling suffocated. The pills were removed from his apartment. Not as a dramatic gesture, but as a practical step. The option that had once sat quietly within reach was no longer there. The absence of that option did not solve anything on its own, but it reduced the immediate risk, creating space for other forms of support to take hold. Meanwhile, Naomi continued her own path of recovery in another part of the city. Though their lives had separated, the parallel nature of their experiences remained. She, too, was working through layers of trauma that could not be addressed all at once. Her therapy sessions focused on identity, on rebuilding a sense of self that had been fractured by the truth she had discovered. Progress came slowly for her as well, marked by moments where she allowed herself to step slightly closer to the life she was trying to rebuild. They did not speak during this time. The distance between them was necessary, not because they had stopped caring, but because they needed to learn how to exist separately before they could even consider what connection, if any, might remain. Each of them carried the same history, the same pain, but they had to process it in their own way. As weeks turned into months, Elias began to notice subtle changes within himself. The emptiness did not disappear, but it shifted. It no longer felt as absolute as it had on the night he nearly ended everything. There were moments, brief and unexpected, where something else surfaced. A sense of calm. A fleeting interest in something outside his own thoughts. These moments did not last long, but they were enough to suggest that the state he had been trapped in was not permanent. One afternoon, standing in front of a mirror, he saw a version of himself that looked different from the one he remembered from that night. The exhaustion was still there. The weight had not lifted completely. But there was something else, something quieter, less obvious, yet significant. He was still there. Not because everything had been resolved. Not because the pain had been erased. But because he had stepped back from the edge. And for the first time since everything had fallen apart, that fact alone began to matter. Because staying, however difficult, however incomplete, meant that the story was still moving forward. And somewhere ahead, beyond the pain he was still carrying, there might be something he had not yet seen. Time did not fix Elias Mercer or Naomi Hale. It did something quieter and far more complex. It forced them to keep moving while carrying everything that had happened, until the weight no longer crushed them completely. The pain did not disappear. It settled into something that became part of their structure, something they had to learn how to live around instead of trying to remove. A year passed, not marked by milestones or celebrations, but by survival. The chaos that had once defined every day slowly gave way to routine. Not a joyful routine, not a fulfilling one at first, but a necessary rhythm that kept them from falling back into the darkness they had both come dangerously close to. Elias left the apartment where he had nearly ended his life. He did not hesitate when the lease ended. There was nothing there he wanted to carry forward. The new place he moved into was smaller, more functional, stripped of anything that could hold emotional weight. It felt temporary, even after he had been there for months. But that was exactly what he needed. A space without history. A place where nothing demanded to be remembered. The first weeks were difficult. The silence returned, but it was different from before. It no longer felt like something closing in on him. It felt like something he had to fill, slowly and deliberately. He began structuring his days with intention. Work became more than just a distraction. It became a framework. Something predictable. Something that existed outside of his past. He showed up on time. He completed tasks. He stayed late when necessary. At first, it was mechanical. Then gradually, it became something steadier. Not passion, not fulfillment, but stability. And stability, after everything he had been through, was enough. There were still moments when the past broke through without warning. He could be sitting at his desk, focused on something simple, when suddenly his mind would drift. A memory would surface. Naomi's face. The hospital. The sound of rain against glass. The weight of everything they had lost. These moments did not disappear, but they changed in intensity. He no longer collapsed under them. He allowed them to pass, even if it took time. Outside of work, his world remained limited. Social connections were still fragile. He had not fully returned to the life he once had, and part of him was unsure if he ever would. But something unexpected began to shift through a chance encounter. One afternoon, during a lunch break, Elias ran into someone from his past. Not someone tied to the trauma, not someone connected to Naomi, but someone from a time before everything had gone wrong. The familiarity of that connection was different. It did not carry the same emotional weight. It was easier, lighter, rooted in a version of himself that had not yet been broken. That reconnection led to small interactions. Occasional conversations. Invitations that he did not always accept, but did not always refuse either. The process was gradual, almost unnoticeable at first. He found himself sitting at a table with a small group of people, listening more than speaking, observing more than participating. But even that was progress. It was during one of those gatherings that he met Lila Cross. She did not stand out in an obvious way. She was not loud, not demanding attention, not trying to make an impression. But there was something about her presence that felt steady. She spoke when necessary, listened when others spoke, and carried herself with a quiet confidence that did not need to be displayed. Elias noticed something immediately, though he could not explain it at first. She did not treat him like someone fragile. She did not approach him with caution or curiosity about his past. She simply interacted with him as if he were just another person in the room. That normalcy, after everything he had experienced, felt unfamiliar and strangely comforting. Their interactions began simply. Short conversations. Shared moments in group settings. Occasional exchanges that did not carry emotional pressure. There were no expectations, no attempts to move things forward too quickly. And that was exactly what allowed something to grow between them. For the first time in a long while, Elias found himself experiencing something that did not immediately connect back to pain. It was subtle. A sense of ease. A moment of calm. The realization that not every interaction had to carry the weight of his past. These moments were not dramatic, but they were significant. Meanwhile, in a different part of the country, Naomi was walking her own path through recovery. She had chosen to move away from her family home, not out of rejection, but out of necessity. Being surrounded by the place where everything had been revealed made it difficult for her to separate herself from the trauma. She needed space, not to forget, but to redefine who she was outside of what had happened. Her new environment was quiet, almost minimal. She kept her life simple, avoiding anything that might overwhelm her. Work became a small but important part of her routine. It was not a demanding job, but it gave her structure. It gave her a reason to leave her apartment, to interact with the world in a controlled way. Therapy remained central to her progress. Unlike the early sessions, where she struggled to speak at all, she began to engage more actively. She explored her past, not as something to escape from, but as something she needed to understand in order to move forward. The process was painful, but it was also necessary. One of the most difficult aspects for Naomi was learning to separate her identity from what had happened. For a long time, she saw herself only through the lens of the tragedy. The lost child. The woman who unknowingly married her brother. The mother of a child born under impossible circumstances. These labels defined her, limiting her ability to see herself as anything else. Over time, that began to change. Not quickly, not easily, but steadily. She started to recognize that her life was not limited to those events. That she existed beyond them. That she still had the ability to make choices, to build something new, even if it would never erase what came before. Her shift was not marked by a single moment of clarity. It came through repetition. Through small decisions. Through days where she chose to engage instead of withdraw. Through moments where she allowed herself to consider the possibility that she deserved something more than survival. It was during one of these moments, on a quiet afternoon under light rain, that she met Caleb Vaughn. The encounter was simple, almost unremarkable. Two strangers caught in the same moment, sharing a brief interaction that could have ended there without consequence. But something about it lingered. Not because it was intense, but because it was gentle. Caleb did not push for conversation. He did not ask questions that reached too deep. He simply existed alongside her in that moment, offering a kind of presence that did not demand anything in return. For Naomi, who had spent so long feeling defined by her past, that kind of interaction felt new. Their connection developed slowly. There was no urgency, no attempt to force meaning where it did not yet exist. They spoke occasionally. They spent time together in ways that felt safe, controlled, manageable. Naomi remained cautious, aware of how fragile her progress still was. But she did not withdraw completely. She allowed the connection to continue, even if she moved carefully within it. As months passed, both Elias and Naomi found themselves building lives they had never expected. Elias grew closer to Lila, not through dramatic declarations, but through consistency, through shared routines, through quiet understanding. He learned to exist in a relationship without losing himself, without rushing, without trying to recreate what he had lost. This connection was different, shaped by everything he had been through, grounded in patience rather than intensity. Naomi's connection with Caleb followed a similar path. It was not about replacing the past. It was about creating something new, something that acknowledged her history without being defined by it. Caleb did not try to fix her. He did not try to understand everything she had experienced. He simply stayed, offering stability in a way that allowed her to open up at her own pace. There were still moments when the past resurfaced for both of them. Elias would occasionally think of Naomi, not with the same crushing pain as before, but with a quiet recognition of what they had shared. Naomi would sometimes find herself remembering Elias, the life they had built, the way it had ended. These memories did not disappear, but they no longer controlled them. What changed was how they responded to those memories. They no longer allowed them to define the present. They acknowledged them, carried them, and continued moving forward. And in that movement, something important began to take shape. Not a perfect life. Not a complete healing. But something real. Something that proved that even after everything had been broken, it was still possible to build again. Time did not return Elias Mercer and Naomi Hale to who they once were. It reshaped them into people who understood loss in a way they never would have chosen, but could no longer avoid. The lives they were building now did not erase the past. They existed alongside it, growing carefully in the space that pain had carved out. Another year passed, and the changes that once felt fragile began to take on weight. Not certainty, not perfection, but something steady enough to stand on. Elias no longer measured his days by survival alone. The routines he had forced himself into gradually became part of who he was. Work no longer felt like an obligation he had to endure, it became something he could rely on. He was not chasing ambition the way he once might have, but he was present. Focused. Capable of finishing what he started without being pulled away by memories at every step. His relationship with Lila developed in the same quiet, deliberate way it had begun. There were no sudden shifts, no overwhelming declarations. Instead, there was consistency. Time spent together that did not feel heavy. Conversations that did not demand explanations he was not ready to give. She never tried to replace anything in his past, and because of that, she never felt like a comparison. She existed entirely in the present, offering something that Elias had not realized he needed, a sense of calm that did not depend on intensity. He learned, slowly, how to be with someone without losing himself. The version of love he had once known had been powerful, consuming, and ultimately devastating. What he found with Lila was different. It did not overwhelm him. It did not demand everything at once. It gave him space to exist as he was, with all the damage he carried, without forcing him to hide it or fix it immediately. There were still moments when his past surfaced. Certain places, certain sounds, certain times of day could pull him back into memories he had not fully left behind. Naomi's presence remained somewhere in him, not as an open wound, but as something that had shaped him permanently. The difference now was that those memories no longer controlled him. They passed through him, acknowledged but not allowed to take over. When he looked at his life now, it did not resemble what he had once imagined. But it was not empty either. It was real. Across the country, Naomi was reaching a similar place, though her path had taken its own direction. Her sense of identity, once shattered beyond recognition, had begun to rebuild itself piece by piece. Therapy had not erased her past, but it had given her the tools to understand it without being consumed by it. She no longer saw herself only through the lens of what had happened. She began to recognize the parts of herself that existed beyond the tragedy. Her work remained simple, but it became meaningful in its own way. It gave her structure, independence, and a sense that she was contributing something, however small, to a world that had once felt completely distant from her. The act of showing up each day, of participating in life even when it felt difficult, became a quiet form of strength. Her relationship with Caleb followed the same pattern of gradual growth. There was no urgency, no pressure to define what they were immediately. He respected the boundaries she needed, allowing her to move at a pace that felt safe. Over time, that patience created trust. Not the kind of trust that forms quickly, but the kind that builds slowly and holds. Naomi began to experience something she had once believed was no longer possible, a sense of stability within herself. It was not constant. It did not eliminate moments of doubt or sadness. But it existed, and it was enough to support the life she was building. Eventually, both Elias and Naomi reached points in their lives where they were ready to take a step that once would have seemed impossible. They chose to commit again. Not because they had forgotten the past, but because they had learned how to live with it. Elias married Lila in a small ceremony that reflected everything his life had become. It was quiet, intentional, free of unnecessary attention. The people present were those who had remained through his darkest moments, those who had seen him at his lowest and stayed anyway. The atmosphere was not one of overwhelming joy, but of something deeper. A sense of grounding. A recognition of how far he had come. Naomi's wedding to Caleb carried a similar tone. It was not defined by grandeur or spectacle. It was defined by presence. By the understanding that what she was stepping into had been built carefully, with awareness of everything she had endured. The day was calm, steady, free from the kind of intensity that once would have overwhelmed her. Neither of them spoke much about their past during these moments. It did not need to be explained. It was already part of them, woven into every decision they had made to reach this point. Months later, in a city that neither of them had planned to visit at the same time, their paths crossed again. The encounter was not dramatic. There was no sudden rush of emotion, no overwhelming reaction. It was quiet, almost ordinary. Two people recognizing each other after a long time, standing still for a moment in a world that continued moving around them. They looked at each other with a kind of understanding that did not require words. Everything that had happened between them still existed, but it no longer demanded resolution. It had already shaped them into who they were. There was no need to revisit the past in detail. No need to reopen wounds that had already begun to heal. What remained was acknowledgement. A recognition of what they had shared, what they had lost, and what they had survived. When they went their separate ways again, it was different from the last time. Before, they had walked away because they had no choice. Now, they walked away because they had found their own paths. The story that had once bound them together in a way neither could control had finally loosened its hold. It had not disappeared. It never would. But it no longer defined the direction of their lives. Somewhere in their memories, there remained the image of a child born under impossible circumstances, a moment that had changed everything. That part of their story would always exist, not as something they could erase, but as something that had forced them to confront truths they never expected to face. And because of that, they had been broken. But they had also been rebuilt. Not into the people they once were, but into people who understood the weight of what it meant to continue. Their lives were not perfect. Their past was not clean. Their story did not resolve into something simple. But it reached something rare. A point where the pain no longer controlled them. A point where the scars remained, but stopped bleeding. And in that quiet, hard-earned place, both Elias and Naomi finally found something that had once felt impossible. They found a way to live.